One of the most eminent constitutional experts, Sir Vernon Bogdanor, has published his latest book, Making the Weather, 6 Politicians That Changed Modern Britain, covering 3 eminent figures on the left, Nye Bevan, Roy Jenkins and Tony Benn, as well as 3 on the right, Enoch Powell, Keith Joseph and Nigel Farage. We began by discussing the latter, the newly elected Member of Parliament for Clacton and leader of the Reform Party. I started by asking him how Nigel Farage has had such a fundamental effect on British politics.
Well, it's not difficult to underline Nigel Farage's effect. He's partly, perhaps largely, responsible for Brexit, which, whether one's in favour of it or not, is the most consequential foreign policy decision we've made since the war. And he's also, I think, largely responsible for destroying 3 Conservative Prime Ministers, David Cameron, Theresa May, and more recently Rishi Sunak. How's he done it? I think the answer's quite simple. He's a brilliant communicator. And that, in a way, is the first task of a politician, to be a communicator. The first task of an academic is to teach and write books. The first task of a politician is to be able to communicate. And sad to say, neither Keir Starmer nor Rishi Sunak, whatever their other virtues, are very good communicators. So I think that's the reason for his success.
And Nigel's always been very good at communicating a complex issue through a simple message. And that has resonated with the people that he's trying to influence.
Absolutely. He speaks to people with language they can understand. He doesn't use language they can't understand, like missions or strategic aims or management speak, which has really taken over both of the major parties, I think, frankly.
But one of the interesting things you say in your chapter about Nigel is that he could get Brexit so far, but that he couldn't have won the referendum on his own because he does alienate quite a lot of people as well as those who he strongly influences.
Absolutely. And one forgets that there was a Conservative vote for Brexit as well as a vote by those in the left-behind areas. And I think that was in large part due to Boris Johnson, who's another good communicator. And it's interesting, it's a paradox in a way, that both of them in their origins are rather remote from most people. They both went to good public schools. Boris Johnson went to Oxford. Nigel Farage worked in the city. And they managed to overcome that handicap, if you like. And someone once asked Nigel Farage, he went to Dulwich College, and that was the same school as the satirical novelist P.G. Wodehouse. And someone asked him once, how can you pretend you're a man of the people when you went to the same public school as P.G. Wodehouse? And he replied, oh yes, Wodehouse. He was 2 years below me.
Which is a very good answer. Wodehouse being one of my great heroes. I read almost all of his works. But you're very interesting in Nigel's time at Dulwich, because there were some later unpleasant stories about how he behaved. And Nigel has attracted a lot of vitriol, but in your researches you found that there was no strong evidence for this.
Well, he did say things as a schoolboy, and which of us hasn't, to seek attention. And he said things for their shock value. And he's done that a bit since. And some of his remarks were racial in their implications. But I do not think there's any evidence he's a racist. And he's attracted a lot more opprobrium for racism than the Labour Party, which was officially accused of racism in the form of anti-Semitism by the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
And then his next campaign, which really helped him in the last election, was over the small boats, which he identified as an issue and brought to people's attention.
Well, yes, immigration is a huge issue now, not just illegal immigration, which there's been a lot of attention given towards, but also legal immigration. It's worth pointing out that in the 1960s, when Enoch Powell spoke about immigration, the rate was about 50,000 net a year. Last year, it was over 700,000 a year, and it's not really, as perhaps it was in the time of Enoch Powell, an issue of colour, because after all, a lot of the immigrants while we were in the EU were white people. It had nothing to do with the issue of race, it just had related to the issue of size, the number of people coming into the country. And Nigel Farage picked on that. It's a very important issue with many people, denied perhaps for too long by the elite, but denied perhaps in part because of the taint that Enoch Powell gave to discussion about immigration. He made it appear racist.
And made it hard for Nigel Farage to bring the issue up, but nonetheless he did very effectively. Reform destroyed the Conservative Party in the 2024 general election. Do you think Nigel will fit into being a Member of Parliament, or going from being a populist outside Parliament who has had enormous political influence, he can go to being somebody who works within the system to make that influence even greater?
Well, I think his effectiveness will lie in speeches in the country rather than in Parliament. And sad to say, when I'm talking to a former MP, I don't think Parliament has the weight that many MPs think it does. If you go back about 20 years, for example, when William Hague was leader of the Conservative opposition, he regularly got the better of Tony Blair in Prime Minister's questions, but it made not the slightest difference to the voter. I mean, 100 years ago, the proceedings of Parliament were reported in great detail in the quality newspapers like The Times, which then was a quality newspaper. But these days, it's not at all so. Most people don't know what's happening in Parliament unless there's some sort of scandal. I think Nigel Farage's influence will remain an influence in the country. And it's also worth pointing out that Enoch Powell's main influence came through speeches in the country, not in Parliament.
Perhaps I'm rather old-fashioned, but I think if you've got a majority of 170 in Parliament, you are therefore legitimate, even if you only got about a third of the popular vote of those who turned out to vote. But will there be an argument for more populist politicians to say actually what the government is doing is not legitimate and to oppose in that way?
I don't think it affects so much the legitimacy of the government in Parliament, but it may do in the country when it gets into trouble. It's worth pointing out one interesting statistic. The vote for the two major parties, Conservative and Labour, totaled 16.5 million. It's the lowest vote for the two major parties since 1923. But in 2016, the vote to leave the European Union was 17.4 million, and of course a very large vote to remain in the European Union. And what this shows, I think, is that the political system is not working for many people. They feel utterly alienated from all the major parties, and this gives Nigel Farage his chance. And the figures show the general election wasn't a surge of enthusiasm for Labour, it was just a desire to punish the Conservatives. But there was no enthusiasm for any of the alternatives, and this gives Nigel Farage his chance, and particularly when the Labour Party starts losing its support amongst its traditional working class supporters, Nigel Farage can speak to them. And he once said that his views are very much like those of the old Labour Party before Tony Blair took it over.
And so you think it's not impossible that Nigel Farage could become Prime Minister one day?
Well, in politics, anything can happen. Who can predict what is going to happen? I think he's very good at seizing political opportunities, let's put it that way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Sir Vernon. Up next, it's the great Patrick Christys. Patrick, what are you discussing this evening?
Well, hello, Jacob. Another great show. So, bisexual flags outside the Foreign Office and women-only paintings in number 11. Is this the wokest government ever? Labour accepted £4 million in donations from a tax haven-based hedge fund that invests in fossil fuels, arms manufacturing and private healthcare. Hypocrisy much. And does Starmer need all these little gifts so he can relax?
Well, that's all excellent. I'm all in favour of people investing in fossil fuels, private healthcare and so on. Anyway, that's all from me.